Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Pho, founder and editor of KevinMD. Today on the show, we have Pratik Doshi. He's a medical student and he co-wrote the KevinMD article, The Opportunities for Medical Students in a Pandemic. Pratik, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Really happy to be here with you.
So we'll get into the article in a bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm a current fourth year medical student at Duke University School of Medicine. I'm originally from Southern California, grew up in Cerritos, California, went to undergrad at the University of Southern California. So really a SoCal boy, I would say. I was a public health major over there and then did a master's in global medicine and entrepreneurship. But have always been interested in kind of the intersection between how you can take advantage of public health situations and really apply creative and innovative solutions to addressing those. So that's kind of been my background. When I came to Duke, I've now, as a fourth year, I spent a research year doing research in global health innovation and improving healthcare access around the world. So I've been working with large funding organizations and a couple other things. And with the COVID-19 situation, things have been like upended in every part of the world and every part of especially medical education. So it's been a really interesting time, especially as somebody with a background in public health, to kind of see different countries' response to it, and also how the medical schools have responded and how like students themselves have kind of stepped up and almost taken a leadership role during this pandemic.
Let's get into that. How have medical students taken a leadership role during the pandemic?
Yeah, so when we first wrote the article, it had only been a couple weeks since like everything had shut down and basically your entire medical education had been upended. For first and second year med students who are normally used to meeting their classmates in a large lecture hall and showing up to anatomy lab or pathology lab, all of that stuff was canceled. So it was difficult for them to move everything online, and that I think really interrupted the medical school process. For third and fourth year students who are normally in the wards, most students were removed from clinical experiences and had to somehow find ways to like supplement their learning. It also became difficult, I think, for medical schools because they couldn't graduate students knowing that they didn't have certain core requirements or core experiences and certify them as competent physicians or competent, students with medical doctorate degrees unless they had those experiences. So in tussling with all that, I think med students realized that, we need to take an active role in shaping our education. One, because we're more familiar with an online format. And two, because we also, interface with, I think, both sides of things. We're talking to physicians and doctors in the hospital, but we're also living in, quote unquote, the real world. And, we see how other people are responding to this pandemic. So it was a really interesting time, I think, for med students because on one end, with daily changing and practices, and we've been having these conversations about burnout and depression for so long, the pandemic really put a lot of pressure on the hospital system and a lot of the mentors and physicians we look up to. On the other end, we saw a society where, people were hoarding PPE, where people weren't sharing, where misinformation was rampant. And there was no unified leadership, especially within the US. And so as med students, you're kind of seeing those two things and you're like, there needs to be some sort of connection here. Like we need to be able to bridge that gap. And I think that's really where med students that I've seen and, I myself have been involved with have kind of stepped up. So med students have organized like drives to collect PPE and donate them to hospitals. They've worked with allied health professions to, do campaigns in the community to increase awareness. I've seen so many people in the healthcare professions post on social media about like flattening the curve, about wearing masks, about sharing appropriate information. So it's really been an incredible response, almost like a ground level or a grassroots response at combating a lot of the misinformation and a lot of the issues that we were seeing at a societal level. And so as med students seeing that, it's almost inspiring and we wanted to get involved. So when we were co-writing the article for the opportunities for medical students during a pandemic, we were kind of at the very beginning of that wave, and now it's even progressed to much more than that, and people have really contributed in meaningful ways.
So if you're a medical student and you're looking to take part in some of these leadership opportunities, is there any organization, is there anywhere that you could look online in terms of how that medical student can take that leadership role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think first, I think there's two parts to that. One, like look internally within your medical school would be my advice there. I'm sure there's a lot of students who are doing a lot of active things to contribute to the community, to, combat the spread of misinformation, to reinforce the health system itself. So I would really encourage you to look into what opportunities already exist, but also look at where the gaps exist. So, for example, I lead a group of students over at Duke called the Duke University Benefits Enrollment Center Fellows. I know it's a little bit of a mouthful of a name, but what we essentially do is we pre-COVID, we used to provide preventative health screenings to low-income community members. We'd go do like blood pressure, BMI, glucose, do some nutrition education, but because the pandemic shut down a lot of the food pantries and a lot of the low-income population, or a lot of the community centers that low-income populations, normally interface with, we had to adapt kind of what we wanted to do. So we called our, community partners. We talked to administrators at Duke, and we're like, how can we still contribute to Durham and the overall Duke community? And so instead, we got in touch with a couple of low-income senior housing complexes. And we got together a group of student volunteers who are now making weekly calls to almost 1,000 residents, low-income senior residents, asking them about food insecurity, asking them about transportation, asking them about how they're doing, their medications, answering questions about COVID, and, just doing general like well-call checks and making sure that we do our part in keeping that senior loneliness at bay. So it's been an incredible thing. And, we've seen this in things scale from one housing complex calling 40 people to now almost 1,000 people across Durham. So that's been really exciting. We're also working with the health system right now to do, we're setting up COVID testing sites in low-income areas across Durham, which has been really exciting. And so I think the really cool part is, like, as you get more involved in this, more and more opportunities keep coming up. And so for med students, I think looking at where there's gaps and seeing if nothing else exists, like stepping in and asking questions, I think is the big thing. We were lucky that we had some of these relationships with community partners already set up. But for anyone who's trying to, do something or have a positive impact, really involving the community beyond like whoever your immediate circle of support is a really critical step in also addressing the needs of the community. So I think there's plenty of ways to get involved, and there's a lot of things that you can do. And there's also like national level organizations now. There's this National Health Student Council that essentially has like a region in every part of the country and has student leaders from medical schools and other health professional schools helping set up volunteer opportunities. So there's a lot of ways that people can get involved and really contribute. And it's just a matter of like putting your foot out there and seeing what you like and seeing which way you can give back.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was the proliferation of misinformation online. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how medical students can help with that issue?
Yeah. So as I'm sure you're aware, and probably a lot of your readers are aware, both from not to make this a political conversation, but there's been a lot of pushback from from the Trump administration and from other officials that kind of negate a lot of the public health knowledge that we commonly accept within the medical community and within the public health community. One being wearing masks and social distancing and all that. Even in my home state of California, there are areas where people are like walking around without masks, not following social distancing orders. And it can become really frustrating as a health provider, especially, I don't know how familiar you are with the graphs, but we were actually doing pretty well in May where the case numbers were starting to drop. We were, quarantining well, things were actually starting to look really good. But because I think we cut back on those restrictions a little too early, those case numbers have shot up much higher than they were even in like March or April. In terms of combating misinformation, one I think is understanding where are people hearing the areas of misinformation or types of misinformation. And a lot of that is coming from like social media, from articles that, are basically negating a lot of the literature that we talk about, and then making the information that we have available addressable to a larger audience. So when physicians talk to each other, we use a certain type of vernacular. When scientists talk to each other, we, use very specific terms. But when you communicate that to a larger audience, you need to make things more visually appealing. You need to not only show them the graph, but kind of give them the short and sweet picture. So I think that's where the younger generation of medical students and health professional students are really, really addressing in the sense that, they're creating those types of like catchy messages and catchy slogans, hashtags and trending things on Twitter and other social media platforms, and really helping steer the conversation towards like better information, towards like showing people what the data is. For example, you may have seen online that picture of like the transmission rates between people who are not wearing masks, between one person who's wearing a mask versus like two people who are wearing masks, and then two people wearing a mask who are then social distancing. That type of visual graphic is, communicates information within 1 or 2 seconds versus the chart from like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, where that data probably originated from. So that, if somebody just posted a picture of the NEJM graph, that's not going to communicate. That might communicate something to you or I, but it's not going to communicate something to the layperson. So we really, I think, as a medical community, need to think, how do we focus our data and our message for the layperson? How do we transmit information effectively, quickly, and on platforms that most people are going to interface with?
We're talking to Pratik Doshi. He's a medical student, and he co-wrote the KevinMD article, The Opportunities for Medical Students in a Pandemic. Pratik, my final question. What's your take-home message that you could share with the other medical students who may be listening to this podcast?
Yeah, Kevin, I think that's a great question. My big take-home message is get involved, like get out there. There's a lot of things that you can do, and across the spectrum. You can be as little involved as you want or as much as you want, but there's things that you can do to make a positive impact. And it's all about just making that first step and getting out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insight, and thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.